The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the dense pine forest. James Whitaker, a seasoned hunter in his early 50s, moved silently through the underbrush. His boots pressed gently into the damp earth, his rifle cradled in his arms with the familiarity of a man who had hunted most of his life. He was not alone. Beside him, his 17-year-old son Alex followed closely. This was their first hunt together in years. Life, school, and distance had kept them apart. But Alex had begged to come on this trip, a bonding weekend like old times. James had been hesitant. Too much time had passed, and the grief between them was unspoken. But seeing the hope in Alex's eyes made it impossible to say no. "You remember what I taught you about silence?" James whispered. Alex nodded, giving a quick thumbs up. The forest held a certain stillness, the kind that precedes a sudden shift in nature. They had seen signs of deer, hoofprints, droppings, a freshly gnawed sapling, but no game yet. James felt the weight of something else, an unease he couldn't place. Alex's presence was both comforting and strange. His boy had grown, taller now, shoulders broader, but still with the curious glint in his eyes. As the sun fell, the mist rolled in, curling low between the trees like a snake slithering through the forest floor. Visibility dropped, but James pressed on. Alex followed, quieter than usual. He wasn't the chatterbox from their last trip. He had changed, more thoughtful perhaps, or maybe just older. They decided to split up briefly. James pointed to the ridge. "Go up there, keep low. If you see anything, give me the signal, 2 clicks. Alex nodded and disappeared into the mist. James circled the lower path, his senses alert. He heard a rustle, then silence. His heart jumped. He raised his rifle, eyes scanning the white veil in front of him. He remembered Alex's position and held his ground. Then 2 soft clicks echoed through the mist. He turned toward the sound. It was closer than expected. He knelt, aimed slowly, breath steady. Another rustle, and then movement. A silhouette darting between trees. His instincts took over. Bang! The forest fell into eerie silence. James lowered his rifle, his heart pounding. "Alex," he called. No response. "Alex!" He yelled louder, panic rising. Then he saw the body. James dropped his rifle and ran. Alex lay sprawled beneath the trees, a red bloom on his chest. His eyes fluttered weakly. "Dad?" he croaked. James cradled him, trying to stop the bleeding. No. "Stay with me, son, please." Alex gripped his father's sleeve, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "It's okay. I knew it might happen. I just wanted to be with you." And then he was gone. James sat there for hours, rocking Alex's lifeless body in his arms. The mist thickened around them, cold and heavy. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He only cried silently, forehead resting against his son's. When he finally stood, his legs trembled. He carried Alex for miles through the forest, refusing to let go. The mist clung to his skin, mixing with the tears he could no longer hold back. He reached the ranger's station at dawn. Sheriff Allen was waiting. He had known James for decades and was the one who had taught him how to track. James could barely speak. "It was me. I shot my boy." An inquiry followed. Technically, it was an accident. Legally, James wasn't at fault. But emotionally, the guilt became his shadow. The town mourned. Alex had been well-liked. Classmates cried. Teachers mourned. James stood stone-faced at the funeral, his wife clinging to him, both of them hollowed out by the tragedy. After the burial, James withdrew from the world. He put away his hunting gear, locked the cabin. Days turned into nights without meaning. He barely spoke. Food lost its taste. He stopped answering calls. His wife tried, but even she couldn't reach him. He was lost in a fog thicker than any mist. For months, James wandered through his house like a ghost. He reread Alex's old letters, watched home videos on repeat. He heard his son's voice in dreams, always the same. "It's okay. Dad, I just wanted to be with you." Winter came and passed. Then spring. One day, he stepped outside and found the forest calling again. Not for hunting, but for healing. He returned to the ridge, stood where Alex had given the signal. He cried there for hours, left a photo tied to a tree. Slowly, he began speaking to schools about hunting safety. He showed photos of Alex, told them about that day. Some cried, some hugged him. One boy reminded him so much of Alex that James couldn't speak for a minute. Eventually, James started a foundation in Alex's name. It funded safety gear, taught teens forest awareness, and provided grief counseling for families who had suffered similar accidents. Years passed. James never stopped mourning, but the weight became something he could carry. He and his wife moved to a smaller home. He planted a tree in the backyard, a pine. Every year on the anniversary, he'd sit beside it and whisper stories. One summer, a young boy named Ethan came to a talk James gave. He waited until the crowd left, then approached. "I lost my brother to an accident," he said. "I was the one who did it." James knelt, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we carry this together." They sat beneath the trees in silence. James never hunted again, but he walked the forest often, sometimes alone, sometimes with others who needed to talk. The mist still rolled in sometimes, curling between the trees. But now it brought memory, not fear. James lived a long life, but life, as it tends to do, kept moving. James's wife, Emily, kept the house filled with warmth. She began to invite children from the neighborhood into their lives. Some had parents who worked long hours. Others were simply curious about the couple, who had turned their sorrow into something meaningful. James would often find himself seated on the back porch, telling stories to the neighborhood kids. They sat in rapt attention as he described the forest, the animals, and yes, eventually, the story of Alex. He never told it in full to the children, but he shared just enough to make them understand how precious life was, how careful they had to be, and how even great sadness could lead to great wisdom. One of the children, a bright boy named Caleb, became especially close to James. He reminded him of Alex in ways that felt both comforting and painful. Caleb had a hunger for stories and a curious mind that never seemed to rest. He began accompanying James on long walks through the forest. At first, Emily was nervous, but she saw the light returning to James's eyes each time he returned home. With Caleb, James felt something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to keep going. He taught the boy how to read tracks, identify birds by their calls, and respect the wild. Caleb was a quick learner, and he never questioned James's pace or his long silences. He simply matched him step for step, heart for heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the mist began to roll in, Caleb turned to James and asked, "Do you think Alex would have liked me?" James looked at him for a long moment before answering. "He would have loved you." Time passed. The foundation James had created expanded. It started offering weekend retreats for families grieving a loss. Emily, ever the organizer, helped run the events. Together, they created safe spaces for healing. Forest walks, campfire storytelling, grief circles, it became something sacred. People came from towns far and wide. They brought pain, and they left with hope. James listened to every story, held every hand, and made sure no one ever felt alone in their sorrow. When Caleb grew older, he volunteered at the foundation. He eventually became one of its strongest voices, and in time, he became the storyteller. James watched with quiet pride as the boy he'd once walked through the forest grew into a man of empathy and strength. James's legacy was no longer just in the trees or the mist. It lived in the hearts of every person who had come through the foundation. It lived in the laughter that echoed during campfires, in the shared meals, the whispered prayers, and the tearful hugs. And though James aged, he never truly grew old. His days were full of purpose. His steps may have slowed, but his spirit remained steady. He wrote a book titled The Mist in the Pines, a gentle memoir about love, loss, and renewal. It became a quiet bestseller, often gifted to those experiencing grief. In his final years, James often sat beneath the pine tree he'd planted for Alex, now tall and strong. Sometimes Emily would join him, sometimes Caleb, and sometimes he sat alone, smiling quietly. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82. At his memorial, people gathered under the pines. Caleb read a passage from James's book. Even in the thickest mist, the heart remembers the way, and even in sorrow, there is love waiting to bloom. Caleb planted another tree beside Alex's and James's, and so the forest grew taller, stronger, full of stories and souls who had found peace beneath the whispering pines. Years had passed since James's peaceful passing, but his legacy lived on. The foundation that bore Alex's name had blossomed into a national movement. What started as one man's quiet tribute to his son had become a beacon of hope for families around the country. Grief counselors, youth mentors, outdoor educators, and even wildlife preservationists found a shared purpose. Beneath the umbrella of Alex's memory, Caleb, now in his early 30s, had taken over as director. He led with humility and compassion, much like James had. He traveled often, visiting schools and parks, spreading the message that tragedy could become a seed for change. At every stop, he brought stories of Alex, of James, and of others who had found light in their darkest moments. One day, while giving a lecture at a university, Caleb met a young woman named Lily. She had lost her father to a mountain hiking accident and had spent years blaming herself. Caleb spoke to her not as a mentor, but as someone who understood the quiet ache of survivors' guilt. They became close. Over time, they fell in love. Their bond wasn't built on the absence of pain, but on the willingness to share it. They hiked together, ran workshops side by side, and eventually married under the very tree James had planted for Alex. Their wedding wasn't traditional. It was intimate, surrounded by pine trees, friends from the foundation, and a quiet breeze that seemed to carry whispers from another world. Caleb spoke a vow that had been forming in his heart for years. We carry their stories not as burdens but as lanterns, lighting the path for those still walking in the dark. Lily cried. So did most of the guests. Together, Caleb and Lily expanded the foundation into a residential retreat center. They built cabins, created hiking trails, and constructed a lodge for year-round programs. Survivors came to write, paint, hike, and heal. Veterans with PTSD, children who lost parents, teachers who lost students. Everyone found space to breathe. Each cabin was named after someone whose life had shaped the foundation's journey. The first two were Alex's Watch and James's Walk. Others followed: Emily's Haven, Sheriff Allen's Stand, and eventually Caleb's Light. The forest around the lodge grew thick and alive with purpose. Pines, birch, wildflowers, all tended to by a team of volunteers who loved the place like home. One year, on the 20th anniversary of Alex's passing, they hosted a special memorial. Hundreds arrived. Emily, now in her 80s, was there, carried in a small wheelchair beneath the tree she and James had planted. Caleb read another passage from The Mist in the Pines. Grief doesn't end, it changes shape. It learns to walk beside joy. It sings in the quiet, dances in the wind, and when we let it, grief becomes a garden. Later that night, as the fire crackled and children laughed nearby, Lily told Caleb she was pregnant. They named their son Alex James Whitaker. Caleb raised young Alex with the same values. James had once taught him respect for nature, for silence, and for the stories we all carry. As he grew, little Alex loved running through the woods, collecting pine cones and asking endless questions. Is this where Grandpa used to walk? Yes, right here, Caleb would say, pointing to the trail. Do you think he can see us? Caleb would smile. I think he walks with us even now. Time, ever faithful, continued its gentle march. Alex grew older, and so did the retreat. They added a school program, taught by instructors who had once been visitors in their darkest hours. Lily published a book of letters from guests who had transformed their pain into purpose. Caleb began writing a second book, and a follow-up to James's memoir, titled The Whispering Pines, Stories That Grew from Sorrow. The book included tales from those who had once come to the retreat as strangers and left as family. Stories of a widowed teacher who found love again, of a soldier who became a sculptor, of a teenager who overcame addiction after finding peace in nature. In the final pages, Caleb wrote, "We are not alone, not in grief, not in joy. Somewhere someone is carrying a piece of our story, and somewhere someone needs us to carry a piece of theirs." It became a national bestseller, but Caleb didn't chase fame. He spent most of his time walking the forest paths, holding his son's hand, listening to the wind through the trees. By the time Alex was a teenager, the lodge had expanded to serve thousands every year. New cabins, a therapy center, an education wing, each one still built in the spirit of that first walk between James and his boy. Eventually, Emily passed away peacefully in the same home she'd shared with James. Caleb found a letter she'd left behind. My sweet boy, thank you for keeping their memory alive. You've turned pain into a legacy of love. Your father would be proud, so proud, and so am I. Keep walking. The pines will always whisper your name. With all my love, Emily. Caleb buried her beside James and Alex beneath the tree line. Another pine was planted. More years passed. More stories were written. And as the seasons turned, the retreat became a sacred place, a forest sanctuary where people found healing, where generations walked together, and where grief was never the end of a story, but the beginning of another. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with friends, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notification so you don't miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for tuning in.